The sea winds howled against the stone walls of Bebbanburg, the mighty fortress that had stood tall for generations. Uhtred, a boy no more than 10 summers old, watched from the battlements as the grey North Sea churned beneath the cliffs. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, the dragon-prowed ships appeared on the horizon, longships. Danes, his heart raced as he glanced at his father, Uhtred, Lord of Bebbanburg. A warrior in every sense of the word, Uhtred the Elder stood at the gates, surrounded by his men. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, eyes narrowed, unflinching as the ships grew larger. He had prepared for this day, and yet the shadow of fear seemed to stretch across the faces of his men. "You see them, boy?" his father asked without turning his head. "The Northmen come for what is ours. This day will be hard fought." Uhtred, trembling slightly, nodded but said nothing. His young mind raced with thoughts of what might come, but his heart held fast to the belief that his father, the lord of this mighty stronghold, could not be defeated. Bebbanburg had never fallen. Below, the villagers scrambled in fear. Women gathered their children, fleeing toward the safety of the inner walls. Men grabbed whatever weapons they could muster, spears, axes, tools, and prepared for battle. The Danes had earned their reputation as a fearsome foe. They were not just raiders but warriors driven by a fierce hunger for land and glory. The longship struck the shore with a thundering crash, their crews leaping into the surf like wolves unleashed. The Danes came ashore with shouts and war cries that echoed against the cliffs. At the head of their army stood Earl Ragnar, a giant of a man with wild, unkempt hair and an axe that glinted in the dimming light. His voice cut through the chaos like a war horn. "Take everything!" Ragnar roared to his warriors. "But leave the boy." The assault on Bebbanburg began in earnest. The Danes swarmed the outer walls, scaling ladders and battering at the gates. Uhtred the Elder led the charge to defend his lands, cutting down the first wave of attackers with brutal efficiency. The clashing of steel, the screams of the dying, and the smell of blood filled the air. Uhtred watched from the ramparts, his small hands gripping the cold stone as the battle unfolded beneath him. His father fought valiantly, his sword slicing through the air, but the Danes kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. Uhtred's heart pounded as he saw the gates give way, the wooden beams cracking under the force of the battering ram. Ragnar's warriors flooded into Bebbanburg, and the Saxon defenders were pushed back toward the keep. In the chaos, Uhtred's eyes locked on a Danish warrior making his way toward his father. The two men clashed in a brutal exchange of blows. His father, though a seasoned warrior, was growing tired, his strikes slower than before. Ragnar himself joined the fray, and Uhtred's heart sank as he saw the moment of doom approach. With a swift, crushing blow, Ragnar's axe found its mark. Uhtred the Elder crumpled to the ground, his lifeblood spilling onto the stones of his beloved Bebbanburg. "No!" Uhtred screamed, his voice hoarse with grief and rage. But there was nothing he could do. His father was gone, and the fortress was lost. The Danes surged forward, capturing the fortress with ruthless efficiency. Uhtred was seized by a group of Ragnar's men, though they handled him not with cruelty but with care, as though following some unspoken command. Struggling, he was dragged toward the ships where Ragnar awaited, his towering form casting a long shadow in the flickering torchlight. The boy stared up at the man who had just killed his father. He expected to feel nothing but hatred, but Ragnar's eyes met his with something different, something almost like respect. "You are the son of Uhtred," Ragnar said, his voice low but firm. "You will come with me." Uhtred spat at the ground, defiant despite his fear. "I will kill you." Ragnar let out a deep laugh, not of mockery but of admiration. "Perhaps one day you will try, boy. But for now, you live." He turned and gestured to his men. "Take him." The journey from Bebbanburg was a blur of misery and confusion for Uhtred. Bound and forced onto a longship, he watched as the flames of Bebbanburg flickered in the distance, marking the end of his old life. The weight of his father's death pressed down on him, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead filled him with dread. As the Danes rode into the night, Uhtred sat in silence, his mind filled with a single burning thought: one day, he would return. One day, he would reclaim Bebbanburg, but for now, he was a captive of the Danes. The boy who had been born Saxon would soon learn the ways of the Northmen, and his journey between two worlds had begun. The waves rocked the longship as it cut through the cold waters of the North Sea. Uhtred huddled on the deck, his hands bound but his spirit unbroken. He could still hear the echoes of Bebbanburg's fall in his mind, the clash of swords, the cries of his people, and his father's last moments. Every gust of wind carried the scent of salt and blood, reminders of all that had been taken from him. Across the deck, Earl Ragnar stood at the prow of the ship, his broad silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. He commanded respect without words, a presence that dominated those around him. Uhtred's gaze fixed on the man who had killed his father. Hatred boiled inside him, yet beneath it lay something unexpected, a strange curiosity about the man who had spared his life. As the longship approached the Danish settlement, Uhtred's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a sprawling village nestled along the coast. Fires flickered in the distance, and the sounds of laughter and song drifted on the wind. It was a place very different from Bebbanburg, alive with a wild and untamed energy. When the ship docked, Ragnar's warriors disembarked, laughing and boasting about their victory. Uhtred, still bound, was hauled from the ship and brought before Ragnar. Ragnar knelt to meet Uhtred's eyes, his expression stern yet not unkind. "This is your new home now, boy," he said. "You are no longer a Saxon. You will live among us, learn our ways. You will become a Dane." Uhtred's jaw clenched. "I will never be one of you." Ragnar smiled, as though amused by Uhtred's defiance. "We shall see." The days that followed were a blur of unfamiliar customs, strange faces, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. Uhtred found himself in the care of Ragnar's family. Ragnar's wife, Sigrid, watched over him with a distant warmth, while Ragnar's children, Ragnar the younger and a fiery girl named Brida, became his closest companions. Ragnar the younger, slightly older than Uhtred, was already on his way to becoming a formidable warrior. Tall and strong, with his father's commanding presence, he treated Uhtred not as an outsider but as a brother. Brida, on the other hand, was fierce and untamed, her wild hair and sharp tongue a match for any boy. She had been captured by Ragnar in a previous raid, much like Uhtred, and had adapted quickly to her new life among the Danes. "You're not a Saxon anymore," Breda said one evening as they sat by the fire, eating roasted meat. "The sooner you realize that, the better." Uhtred stared at the flames, anger simmering beneath his skin. "I don't care what they say. I am Uhtred of Bebbanburg." Breda shrugged, tossing a bone into the fire. "Maybe. But you're also alive. That's more than most Saxons can say." Her words stung, but Uhtred could not deny the truth in them. He had seen the fate of those who resisted the Danes. His survival depended on learning their ways, whether he liked it or not. Days turned into weeks, and Uhtred began to adapt to the rhythm of life among the Danes. It was a world governed by strength, honor, and the pursuit of glory. Every morning, he trained with Ragnar's warriors, learning the art of combat as a Dane. The sword felt different in his hand now, the strikes fiercer, more purposeful. Under Ragnar's tutelage, Uhtred grew stronger, faster, and more cunning. He learned to fight like a Viking, embracing the ferocity of battle. Ragnar watched his progress with a keen eye. "You are not Saxon anymore," he would say as Uhtred trained. "You fight like one of us now." But the truth was, Uhtred was not just learning how to fight, he was learning what it meant to live among the Danes. Their way of life, their gods, their customs all seeped into his bones. He listened to their tales of Odin, Thor, and the gods of the north, stories filled with valor and tragedy. He marveled at the way they spoke of fate, the Norns weaving the threads of their lives in patterns no man could escape, yet, for all the brutality and chaos, there was a sense of freedom that Uhtred had never felt in Bebbanburg. The Danes lived without fear of kings or priests. They were masters of their own destinies, and in their eyes, Uhtred saw something he had never seen in the Saxons. Joy Point one evening, as the sun set over the settlement, Ragnar invited Uhtred to sit with him. The warlord's face, lined from years of battle, softened in the glow of the fire. "You are beginning to understand our ways, Uhtred," Ragnar said, his voice low. "You have the heart of a warrior. But do not think that makes you a Dane. That is something you must choose." Uhtred stared into the flames. "I don't know what I am anymore." Ragnar smiled. "That is good. It means you are thinking, and thinking is what makes a man strong." A silence fell between them, and Uhtred felt a strange kinship with Ragnar in that moment. He did not want to admit it, but there was a part of him that admired the man, a part that longed to be seen not as a Saxon boy but as an equal. As the months passed, Uhtred grew closer to Ragnar's family. He and Ragnar the younger became inseparable, fighting and laughing side by side. Together, they would practice with swords, learning the deadly dance of combat. They would race through the forests, hunt for game, and dream of the day when they would lead raids of their own, but it was Breda who challenged Uhtred the most. Her sharp wit and fearless nature kept him on his toes, and despite her fierce exterior, Uhtred could sense the bond forming between them. They were both outsiders in their own way, and that shared understanding drew them together. "You can hate the Danes all you want," Breda said one day, as they sat by the river, skipping stones across the water. "But they're not all bad. Ragnar saved us both, didn't he?" Uhtred nodded, though he didn't fully understand why. He still carried the weight of his father's death and the loss of Bebbanburg, but he could not deny that Ragnar had given him something no Saxon would have, life and a chance to prove himself. By the end of the year, Uhtred had become part of the fabric of Ragnar's household. He was no longer just the Saxon boy they had captured, he was Uhtred, a warrior in the making, bound to both Saxon blood and Danish life. And while he did not yet know where his true loyalties lay, he understood one thing: his destiny was no longer just his own. It was intertwined with the people who had taken him in, with Ragnar, with Breda, and with the gods of the north, and deep in his heart, the fire to reclaim Bebbanburg still burned, though now it was tempered by the bonds he had forged among the Danes. The cold bite of the wind cut across the open field as Uhtred stood at the edge of the Danish training grounds. The clang of swords and the grunts of men filled the air as Ragnar's warriors drilled relentlessly, their movements honed by years of battle. Today, Uhtred was not just an observer. He was a participant. That he stood beside Ragnar the Younger, the two of them gripping wooden swords meant for practice but still capable of causing pain. Across from them were seasoned warriors, men who had raided the coasts of England and Francia, their faces weathered and hardened by years of war. This was no ordinary training. It was a test, a rite of passage for young men who would soon earn their place in the shield wall. Ragnar the Younger looked at Uhtred, his face marked with a confident grin. "Ready, Saxon?" Uhtred smirked, tightening his grip on the hilt of his sword. "I'll make you eat those words." The signal was given, and the clash began. The warrior facing Uhtred lunged forward, his wooden sword arcing toward Uhtred's head. Instinctively, Uhtred blocked the blow, his arms shaking from the impact. The warrior pressed forward, forcing Uhtred back with each strike. But Uhtred was quick, ducking beneath the man's swing and delivering a sharp blow to his side. The warrior grunted, impressed by the boy's speed, but Uhtred knew this was only the beginning. The training was brutal. Each strike was met with resistance, and every mistake was punished by swift, painful blows. Uhtred's arms ached, his muscles burned, but he kept fighting. The Danes fought with a ferocity he had never seen among the Saxons. There was no room for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. The only thing that mattered was survival and victory. By the time the training ended, Uhtred was covered in bruises, his body sore, but a fierce pride surged within him. He had held his own against the Danish warriors, earning nods of approval from Ragnar's men. Even Ragnar himself had watched, arms crossed, as Uhtred fought with the heart of a true warrior. As the warriors dispersed, Ragnar approached, his eyes gleaming with approval. "You fight well, boy. You fight like a Dane." Uhtred nodded, though something stirred uneasily in his chest. He had fought like a Dane, yes. But what did that mean for who he truly was? As the weeks passed, Uhtred's training intensified. He learned not only the art of combat but the strategies that made the Danes such a feared force. Ragnar often took him aside, teaching him how to read a battlefield, how to exploit an enemy's weaknesses, and how to lead men into battle. It was more than just swinging a sword. It was about understanding the heart of war itself. Yet, as Uhtred's skills grew, so did his doubts. The more he embraced the ways of the Danes, the more he questioned where his loyalties truly lay. He had been born a Saxon, raised in Bebbanburg, and that heritage still ran through his veins. But the Danes had given him a life, a purpose. They had taken him in when his own people had abandoned him. It was Breda who noticed the shift in him first. One evening, as they sat by the fire outside Ragnar's hall, she studied him with a knowing look. "You've been quiet lately." Uhtred glanced at her, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "I've been thinking." "About what?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "About who I am," Uhtred admitted. "I was born a Saxon. My father was a Saxon lord. But here, with Ragnar, I'm something else." Breda snorted. "You're overthinking it, Uhtred. Who cares where you were born? What matters is what you do now, who you fight for." Uhtred didn't respond immediately. His eyes drifted to the men around the fire, the warriors who had become his brothers in arms. He had fought alongside them, trained with them, but the question still gnawed at him: was he truly one of them, or was he still an outsider? The answer came soon enough, when Ragnar announced that they would be joining a raid on a Saxon village along the coast. It would be Uhtred's first true test in battle, and the thought of it filled him with equal parts excitement and dread. This was what he had trained for, what he had been preparing for ever since he had been captured. But it was also a step that would take him further from his Saxon roots and deeper into the brutal life of the Danes. The morning of the raid, the sky was heavy with dark clouds as the longship set sail. Uhtred stood at the bow of Ragnar's ship, his sword at his side, the wind tugging at his hair. Beside him, Ragnar the younger grinned in anticipation, eager for the bloodshed to come. "Are you ready, Uhtred?" he asked. Uhtred nodded, though inside, his stomach churned. He had been trained to kill, to fight for glory and survival. But this would be different. This would be real. The village came into view, a small settlement nestled along the shoreline. The longships glided silently toward the shore, and Uhtred felt the tension in the air. The warriors around him, so full of life and laughter, now wore expressions of grim determination. This was their way, taking what they wanted by force, with no mercy for the weak. The moment the ships hit the beach, the Danes poured out, weapons in hand, roaring as they charged toward the village. Uhtred followed, his heart pounding in his chest, his sword heavy in his hand. The raid was a blur of chaos. The Danes moved swiftly, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Houses were set ablaze, livestock driven off, and the screams of the villagers filled the air. Uhtred swung his sword, felling a man who came at him with a pitchfork. The blood splattered on his face, hot and thick, and for a moment, he felt nothing but shock. But then something inside him shifted, his training took over, and he fought as he had been taught, swift, brutal, and without hesitation. He became part of the storm, his sword a blur as he cut down his enemies. The adrenaline surged through his veins, and for the first time, he understood the thrill the Danes felt in battle. This was not just survival. This was power. The raid ended as quickly as it had begun. The village was left in ruins, its people scattered or dead. Uhtred stood among the wreckage, breathing heavily, his sword stained with blood. Around him, the Danes cheered and laughed, celebrating their victory. Ragnar approached, clapping Uhtred on the back. "You fought well, Uhtred. You are one of us now." Uhtred nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He had fought like a Dane, killed like a Dane. But the sight of the burning village, the bodies strewn across the ground, weighed heavily on him. These had been Saxons, his people. And yet, in the heat of battle, he had not hesitated. As the Danes began to return to their ships, laden with spoils, Uhtred lingered for a moment, staring at the village he had helped destroy. He felt the pull of both worlds, the Saxon blood in his veins and the Danish life he had embraced. And for the first time, he wondered if he would ever truly belong to either. The campfires burned low as the Danish warriors gathered around Ragnar's hall, their laughter and boasts filling the night air. Uhtred sat among them, his sword resting against his knee, his thoughts far from the revelry around him. The raid had been a success, but the weight of what he had done still lingered, gnawing at him. He had fought for the Danes, for Ragnar, but the faces of the fallen Saxons haunted his dreams. As the fire crackled, Ragnar's war council gathered nearby. Uhtred listened with half an ear, the men's voices blurring into the background until he heard a name spoken, a name that pierced through the fog in his mind. Alfred, one of the warriors said. The King of Wessex. Uhtred's head snapped up, and he leaned in, listening more closely. Ragnar nodded, his expression grim. Alfred holds the last true Saxon kingdom. He resists us still, even as the other kingdoms fall. He is a thorn in our side, and if we are to conquer all of England, Wessex must fall. The mention of Wessex stirred something deep inside Uhtred. He had heard of Alfred before, even as a child in Bebbanburg. Alfred, the youngest son of the Saxon king, had risen to lead Wessex after his brothers had fallen, and he had become a symbol of defiance against the Danish invaders. Unlike the other Saxon kings who had crumbled under the weight of the Viking onslaught, Alfred remained, a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. Ragnar's voice lowered. Word is, Alfred has united the remnants of the Saxon armies. He fights not just for Wessex but for all of England. Uhtred felt a strange pull at the mention of Alfred's name, as if the shadow of the Saxon king had reached across the distance between them. He was a man of cunning and strategy, a king who used his mind as much as his sword. It was said that Alfred was a devout Christian, a man of great faith, but also one who valued knowledge and wisdom. He had built fortresses, created alliances, and used diplomacy where others had resorted to brute strength. Uhtred couldn't shake the thought, if Alfred still lived, then so did the hope of Saxon resistance. Over the next few days, the talk of Alfred spread like wildfire through the Danish camp. The warriors, though confident in their strength, spoke of Alfred with a mix of respect and irritation. He was the one man who stood between them and total domination of England. Breda, always quick to mock the Saxons, scoffed at the stories. Alfred may be clever, but he is weak. His kingdom will fall just like the rest. Uhtred wasn't so sure. There was something about Alfred that intrigued him, something that gnawed at his mind late into the night. What kind of king could hold out against the might of the Danes when all others had fallen? His internal conflict deepened with each passing day. He had spent years living among the Danes, learning their ways, their culture. Ragnar had become like a father to him, and Ragnar the younger and Breda were the closest things he had to family. But the more he heard about Alfred, the more he was reminded of his Saxon roots. One night, as he sat by the fire sharpening his sword, Ragnar approached him. The warlord's face was calm, but his eyes gleamed with the intensity of a man always thinking of the next battle. "You've been quiet lately," Ragnar said, sitting beside Uhtred. "What troubles you?" Uhtred hesitated before speaking. "Alfred." Ragnar raised an eyebrow. "The Saxon king?" Uhtred nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "They say he fights for all of England. For the Saxons. For something greater than just a kingdom." Ragnar chuckled, though there was no malice in it. "Alfred is clever, yes. But he is still just a man. Men die, Uhtred, no matter how grand their dreams. But what if he succeeds?" Uhtred asked, his voice quieter now. "What if he unites the Saxons? What if he creates something that can stand against us?" Ragnar's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked not like a warlord but like a father offering advice to a son. "It is good that you think of these things. A warrior must know his enemy. But do not let yourself be swayed by dreams, Uhtred. Alfred's vision is for the Saxons, but you are with us now. You have the heart of a Dane." Uhtred looked away, the fire casting shadows on his face. "I don't know what I am anymore." Ragnar placed a hand on Uhtred's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You are my son, Uhtred. That is enough." As the days passed, Uhtred's thoughts became more conflicted. He had fought for the Danes, trained with them, and lived among them. But the news of Alfred had stirred something long dormant inside him, a connection to his Saxon heritage that he could not easily dismiss. One evening, he found himself in a quiet moment with Brida. She had noticed the change in him as well, though she had not pressed the matter until now. "You're thinking about Alfred, aren't you?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. Uhtred nodded. "I can't stop." Brida narrowed her eyes. "Why? You're not a Saxon anymore. You've seen what they are, weak, divided, and easy to conquer." "But Alfred is different," Uhtred said, his voice firm. "He's not like the others. He's fighting for something greater." Brida's expression darkened. "You're starting to sound like one of them again." Uhtred turned to face her, frustration boiling inside him. "Maybe because I am one of them. My father was a Saxon lord. I was born in Bebbanburg. I was meant to be its lord one day." Brida's eyes flashed with anger. "Your father is dead, Uhtred. Bebbanburg is lost. The Saxons are nothing compared to the Danes. We are strong. We take what we want." Uhtred's fists clenched. "And what if I don't want to be a Dane? What if I don't want to raid and kill for the rest of my life?" Brida glared at him, her voice cold. "Then you are a fool." The argument left Uhtred more conflicted than ever. He had always admired Brida's strength and her loyalty to the Danes, but her words cut deep. He could not deny the pull of his Saxon blood, nor could he ignore the life he had built among the Danes. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Uhtred made a decision. He needed to see Wessex for himself, to understand the man who had become a symbol of hope for the Saxons. He would not betray Ragnar or the Danes, but he could no longer ignore the voice inside him that whispered of his past, of his birthright, and of the future. Alfred promised that he would go south, to the lands of Wessex, to see this king, Alfred the Great, for himself. The air smelled of smoke and blood as Uhtred stood before the smoldering remains of Ragnar's hall. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the full weight of the tragedy bore down on him. Ragnar's once great stronghold, the heart of his Danish world, was reduced to ash and ruin. The bodies of Ragnar's warriors lay scattered across the ground, some still clutching their weapons, others butchered where they stood. It was a betrayal. Uhtred knew at the moment he saw the Danish banners among the wreckage, banners that did not belong to Ragnar. His family had not fallen to the Saxons but to their own people, betrayed by those they had once called allies. Uhtred's hand gripped the hilt of his sword so tightly his knuckles turned white. Ragnar had been like a father to him, and now he was gone, murdered in the night by men who sought to seize power. The betrayal cut deep, severing the bonds of loyalty Uhtred had held for years. And as the smoke drifted into the sky, a dark resolve hardened within him. It had started with whispers, rumors of unrest among the Danish jarls, of growing tensions over power and territory. But no one had expected such an open and brutal attack. Ragnar's hall had been well fortified, his warriors strong and loyal. But even the strongest fortress could fall when treachery worked from within. Uhtred and Brida had been away when the attack came, scouting the nearby lands for a potential raid. By the time they returned, it was too late. The betrayal had already been carried out, and Ragnar was dead. Brida stood beside Uhtred, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Her eyes were fixed on the smoking ruins, but Uhtred could see the pain behind her rage. Ragnar had been her father as much as he had been Uhtred's. The loss was unbearable, and the betrayal unthinkable. They killed him, Brida whispered, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. Our own people killed him. Uhtred didn't respond. His mind was racing, piecing together what had happened, trying to make sense of the senseless. But the truth was clear, Ragnar had been betrayed, and those responsible had to be punished. We have to go, Brida said, her voice now cold and steady. Before they come back. Uhtred nodded, though his heart screamed to stay, to fight. But Brida was right, there was no fighting here. Not yet. They were outnumbered, and those who had betrayed Ragnar would be hunting them soon enough. If they stayed, they would be cut down just as the others had been. They fled into the night, leaving behind the only home they had known for years. The forest swallowed them, the darkness offering temporary shelter from the forces that now hunted them. Uhtred's mind raced, torn between grief and fury, between loyalty and survival. As they ran, Uhtred couldn't stop thinking about Ragnar. The man had taken him in when he was just a boy, raised him as one of his own. Uhtred had fought beside him, learned from him, and now, Ragnar was dead because of a betrayal from his own people. Brida ran beside him, her breath sharp and angry in the cold night air. She was as fierce as ever, but Uhtred could see the pain in her eyes. Ragnar had been everything to her, the father she had never had, the man who had taught her to fight and survive in a brutal world. We'll kill them, Breda growled as they slowed to catch their breath. Every last one of them. Uhtred glanced at her, his jaw clenched. We will. But not yet. Breda looked at him, her eyes burning with hatred. Why not? They deserve to die for what they did. They'll be expecting us to strike now, Uhtred replied, his voice steady but cold. We need to be smarter than that. We need to find out who was behind this. And then we'll make them pay. Breda didn't like it, Uhtred could tell. She wanted revenge, wanted blood now. But Uhtred knew they couldn't afford to be reckless. Not with the entire Danish world turning against them. They needed a plan, and they needed allies. In the days that followed, Uhtred and Breda traveled in secret, staying to the shadows, avoiding any Danish camps. The betrayal had shattered their world, and they were hunted now, traitors in the eyes of the Danes. They could trust no one. As they traveled, Uhtred's thoughts drifted back to his Saxon roots. With Ragnar gone, and the Danes turning on each other, he found himself thinking more and more about the Saxons, about the land he had once called home. He had spent so long fighting for the Danes, but now, with his ties to them severed, the pull of his birthright became stronger. One night, as they sat by a small fire in the woods, Breda spoke what had been lingering between them. We have no place among the Danes anymore, she said, her voice bitter. We are outcasts. Uhtred stared into the fire. We still have our revenge. Breda nodded, but her eyes narrowed. And after? What then? We can't go back to them. They'll never accept us now. Uhtred was silent for a long moment. He knew what she was saying was true. The life he had known among the Danes was gone. Ragnar was dead, and with him, the ties that had bound Uhtred to the Danish world. But what else was there? He had long forsaken his Saxon roots, embraced the life of a Dane. Could he truly return to the land of his birth? Could he reclaim the birthright he had abandoned so many years ago? I'm going back to Bebbanburg, Uhtred said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Breda looked at him, her face a mix of surprise and anger. Bebbanburg? You think they'll just welcome you back after all this time? Uhtred shook his head. No. But it's my land. It's my birthright. I'm going to take it back. Breda scoffed. And what about our revenge? What about Ragnar? We'll have our revenge, Uhtred promised, his eyes hard. But I need to reclaim who I am first. I need to go back. And so, Uhtred's path became clear. He would return to Bebbanburg, to the lands of his birth, and reclaim what was rightfully his. He would return to the Saxons, but not as the boy who had been taken all those years ago. He would return as a warrior, as a man who had been forged in the fires of war and betrayal. But even as he made this decision, Uhtred knew the journey ahead would be fraught with danger. The Saxons might see him as a traitor, a man who had fought against his own people. The Danes would see him as a threat, a man who had turned his back on them. He would have to fight for his place in the world, just as he had always done. But now, his purpose was clear. He would reclaim his birthright. He would avenge Ragnar. And in doing so, he would forge his own path, one that straddled both worlds, Saxon and Dane, but was beholden to neither. Uhtred had lost everything. But in that loss, he had found the strength to rebuild, to reclaim his destiny, and to carve out a future of his own making. The journey to Wessex had been long and arduous, with Uhtred and Breda constantly looking over their shoulders, aware that the Danes who had betrayed Ragnar were still hunting them. But Uhtred's mind was already focused on what lay ahead, Wessex, and more importantly, King Alfred. He knew little of the Saxon king beyond his reputation as a clever, devout ruler who had managed to hold off the Danish invaders. Uhtred wasn't sure how he would be received, a man raised among the Danes, a warrior with a pagan past. As they approached the heart of Wessex, the land seemed different, more organized, more disciplined than the war-torn chaos Uhtred had known among the Danes. Saxon fortresses dotted the landscape, their walls thick and tall, manned by soldiers who looked on with suspicion as Uhtred and Breda passed. At last, they reached Alfred's stronghold, the seat of Saxon power. Uhtred could feel the weight of eyes upon him as he and Breda were led inside the halls of the king, their clothing and bearing marking them as outsiders. The Saxons around them whispered, some sneered. Uhtred caught snatches of their conversations, words like Dane, heathen, and traitor reached his ears. His past was written in every glance they threw at him. At the end of the hall stood King Alfred, flanked by his advisors and warriors. He was not what Uhtred had expected. Alfred was not a towering figure or an imposing warrior. He was thin, almost frail, his face pale and lined with the burden of leadership. But his eyes were sharp, piercing, and full of intellect. Uhtred immediately understood why this man had held back the Danes when so many other kings had fallen. As Uhtred and Breda approached, Alfred's gaze lingered on them both, weighing them as if he could discern their entire story just from their appearance. You are Uhtred of Bebbanburg, Alfred said, his voice calm but firm. Born a Saxon, raised a Dane. Uhtred straightened, meeting Alfred's gaze without flinching. I am. And this is Breda, Alfred continued, glancing at her with a hint of disdain. Also raised among the Danes. Breda bristled under Alfred's scrutiny, but Uhtred held her back with a look. Now was not the time for anger. They were here to seek refuge, to form alliances, not to fight. You come to me now, after years of fighting for my enemies, Alfred said, his tone carefully neutral. Why? Uhtred stepped forward. I come because I no longer have a place among the Danes. My lord, Earl Ragnar, has been betrayed by his own people, murdered by those who seek power for themselves. I have nothing left there. Alfred studied Uhtred for a long moment, then nodded slightly. And what do you seek from me? Why Wessex? I seek to reclaim what is mine, Uhtred replied, his voice steady. Bebbanburg is my birthright, taken from me when I was just a boy. The Danes will never help me win it back. But I will fight for you, if you will fight for me. Alfred raised an eyebrow. You offer to fight for Wessex? A man who has spent years raiding and killing Saxons at the side of the Danes. Uhtred held Alfred's gaze. I fought for Ragnar. I have no loyalty to the Danes who killed him. You want warriors, men who know how to fight the Danes and win. I am that man. A heavy silence fell over the hall. Uhtred could feel the tension in the air, the mistrust. He knew that convincing Alfred would not be easy. His Danish past hung over him like a shadow, a constant reminder of the blood he had spilled for the enemy. Alfred's eyes narrowed. "I do not trust you, Uhtred. You may speak of loyalty, but you are a pagan, raised by those who have ravaged my lands, destroyed my people, and slaughtered my kinsmen. Why should I believe that your loyalties have truly shifted?" Uhtred didn't flinch. "Because I have nothing left among the Danes. Ragnar was my family, and he is dead. His killers are my enemies now, just as they are yours." Alfred's expression remained unreadable, his calculating mind working through Uhtred's words. He glanced at his advisors, some of whom shook their heads in disapproval, their distrust evident. But Alfred was a man of strategy, and Uhtred could see the gears turning in his mind. "I do not trust you," Alfred repeated, "but I have use for men like you, men who know the ways of the Danes, who can fight like them. Perhaps your knowledge can serve Wessex. But make no mistake, Uhtred, I will be watching you. One misstep, one sign of betrayal, and you will not live to see Bebbanburg." Uhtred met Alfred's gaze, his voice unwavering. "I will fight for you. And I will prove my loyalty." Alfred nodded slowly. "Then you will have your chance." Over the next few days, Uhtred was given small tasks, missions that tested his loyalty to Wessex. He and Breda were sent to scout Danish camps, to gather intelligence on their movements. The Saxons kept a close eye on him, always suspicious, always ready for a sign that he might turn on them. Uhtred did his duty, but the tension between him and the Saxons grew with each passing day. The distrust was palpable. The Saxons viewed him as a Dane in Saxon clothing, a man who had fought for their enemies for too long to ever truly be one of them again, but Uhtred remained focused. Each mission brought him closer to Alfred's trust, and each successful task gave him hope that he could win back his birthright. He was a warrior, and in time, the Saxons would see that he was valuable. Breda, however, was less patient. The disdain from the Saxons grated on her, and she often lashed out, her anger boiling over intense moments. Uhtred had to remind her time and again that they needed Alfred's help, that they could not afford to alienate him or his people. One day, Alfred called Uhtred into his private chambers. The king was seated at a large table, maps and documents spread out before him. He looked up as Uhtred entered, his expression thoughtful. "I have another task for you," Alfred said. "A dangerous one." Uhtred nodded. "Tell me." "There is a Danish warlord, Skorpa, who has been raiding my southern villages. He is brutal, cunning, and a threat to my people. I need him dealt with, but I cannot afford to send my own men. They do not know his ways as you do." Uhtred's eyes narrowed. He had heard of Skorpa, a vicious warlord known for his cruelty in battle. It would not be an easy mission, but Uhtred knew this was his chance to prove his worth to Alfred once and for all. "I'll kill him," Uhtred said without hesitation. Alfred nodded. "Do this, and you will have my trust. And perhaps, the support you need to reclaim Bebbanburg." As Uhtred left Alfred's chambers, a sense of purpose filled him. The path ahead was dangerous, but it was clear. If he could rid Wessex of Skorpa, he would solidify his place in Alfred's court an inch closer to reclaiming his birthright. But as Uhtred prepared for the mission, he knew that proving his loyalty to Alfred would not be the end of his trials. The Saxons still distrusted him, and his connection to the Danes made him an outsider in both worlds. He would have to walk a fine line between his Saxon heritage and his Danish upbringing, between the king who distrusted him and the bloodthirsty warlords who wanted him dead. The sky was thick with dark clouds as Uhtred rode alongside the Saxon forces toward the hill fort of Sinwit. A cold wind blew from the west, carrying with it the promise of bloodshed. The Danes, led by the infamous warlord Skorpa, had been raiding the surrounding lands for weeks, and now they had entrenched themselves on the hill, daring Alfred to challenge them. Uhtred's hands tightened on the reins of his horse as they approached the battlefield. This was his chance, to prove himself to Alfred, to show the Saxons that he was not just a Dane in disguise. The tension in the air was palpable, and as they drew closer to the hill, Uhtred could hear the clang of steel, the battle cries of the Danes, and the steady drum of war. Uhtred had fought many battles before, but this one was different. He wasn't fighting for Ragnar, or for Danish glory. He was fighting for Wessex, for a people who didn't trust him, who saw him as an outsider. Yet, deep within, Uhtred knew he needed this victory, not only to prove his loyalty to Alfred but to inch closer to his own goal of reclaiming Bebbanburg. The Saxon army gathered at the base of the hill, the steep incline leading to Skorpa's fortified position. The Danish warlord had chosen his ground well. The hill provided a natural defense, with sheer drops on either side. It would be a difficult battle, and Alfred's forces would need both strategy and strength to overcome it. As Uhtred surveyed the battlefield, his gaze locked onto the Danish banners flying high above. He felt a pang of nostalgia for the life he had once lived among the Danes. Skorpa's men fought as he once had, with fire and fury, driven by their pagan gods and the desire for conquest. But Uhtred shook the thought away. Those days were behind him. Now, his place was here, among the Saxons. King Alfred, mounted on a horse nearby, gave Uhtred a measured glance before turning to address his commanders. The tension between them had grown since Uhtred's arrival in Wessex. Despite Uhtred's loyalty in recent tasks, Alfred's mistrust lingered, his belief in Uhtred's Danish past ever present. The other Saxon lords, too, eyed him with suspicion, whispering behind his back, but none of that mattered now. Uhtred would show them all what he was capable of. As the battle began, Uhtred found himself in the thick of it, leading a group of Saxon warriors up the hill. The ascent was brutal. The Danes rained down arrows and rocks from their fortified position, forcing the Saxons to take cover behind their shields. Men fell around him, their bodies tumbling back down the hill, but Uhtred pressed on. With a roar, Uhtred led his men in a charge, their shields clashing against the Danish line. The sounds of battle filled the air, the clash of steel on steel, the cries of the dying, the roar of warriors locked in combat. Uhtred's sword flashed in the dull light as he cut down his enemies, his movements fluid and deadly, honed by years of fighting alongside the Danes. Despite the chaos around him, Uhtred fought with precision. His time among the Danes had made him a brutal and efficient warrior, and now, that skill served the Saxons. He fought with a savagery that unsettled the Saxon soldiers around him. They had never seen such ferocity from one of their own. To them, Uhtred was a storm, relentless, unstoppable. As the battle raged, Uhtred caught sight of Skorpa, the Danish warlord, standing at the top of the hill, directing his men. A wave of fury washed over Uhtred. Skorpa was the reason they were here, the reason so much Saxon blood had been spilled. With a battle cry, Uhtred charged through the enemy ranks, cutting down anyone in his path as he made his way toward Skorpa. The moment Uhtred reached the crest of the hill, he came face to face with the warlord. Skorpa, tall and broad, with wild eyes and a blood-stained axe, sneered at Uhtred as if recognizing the Saxon-born, Dane-raised warrior. "So, the Saxon with a Dane's heart comes to face me," Skorpa growled, his voice thick with disdain. Uhtred didn't waste words. With a fierce cry, he lunged at Skorpa, their blades clashing in a violent storm of steel. The warlord fought with the strength of a berserker, his axe whistling through the air with deadly force, but Uhtred matched him blow for blow. The two warriors fought on the narrow ridge of the hill, surrounded by the chaos of battle. Skorpa was strong, but Uhtred was faster. As their fight raged on, Uhtred's superior skill began to show. With a final, powerful strike, Uhtred drove his sword through Skorpa's chest, the warlord's eyes widening in shock before he collapsed to the ground. For a moment, Uhtred stood there, breathing heavily as he looked down at Skorpa's body. The battle still raged around him, but the death of the Danish warlord had turned the tide. The Danes, seeing their leader fall, began to falter. The Saxons pressed their advantage, driving the Danes back and taking control of the hill. The Battle of Sinwit was won. After the battle, Uhtred stood among the Saxon warriors, his body covered in blood and grime. His victory over Skorpa had earned him a grudging respect from the men around him, but their eyes still carried a mix of admiration and suspicion. To them, Uhtred was an enigma, neither fully Saxon nor fully Dane. His skill in battle was undeniable, but his past continued to cast a long shadow over him. As Uhtred cleaned his sword, he caught sight of King Alfred approaching, flanked by his trusted commanders. Alfred's face was unreadable, his eyes scanning the battlefield before finally settling on Uhtred. "You fought well today," Alfred said, his tone measured. "The death of Skorpa has weakened the Danes' hold on the south." Uhtred nodded but said nothing. He could sense that despite the victory, there was something else in Alfred's mind. The king studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Your skill in battle is impressive, Uhtred. But there are those among my court who still question where your true loyalties lie." Uhtred felt a flicker of anger at the accusation. "I have fought for Wessex. I have risked my life for your people." Alfred's gaze hardened. "And yet, you fight like a Dane. You kill like one of them. The men whisper about you, Uhtred. They fear you as much as they admire you." Uhtred clenched his jaw, his frustration building. No matter what he did, no matter how many victories he won for Wessex, he would always be seen as an outsider, a man caught between two worlds. "I am loyal to Wessex," Uhtred said, his voice steady but filled with defiance. "I am loyal to the land of my birth." Alfred nodded slowly but did not seem fully convinced. "Time will tell, Uhtred. Time will tell." As the Saxon forces prepared to march back to their stronghold, Uhtred was left with a sense of unease. The victory at Sinwit had been decisive, but the battle for his place among the Saxons was far from over. The rift between him and Alfred was growing wider, and Uhtred could feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on him. He had proven his worth on the battlefield, but earning the trust of Wessex, and of Alfred, would take far more than bloodshed. Uhtred knew that the road ahead would be treacherous. He was still a man between two worlds, and neither the Saxons nor the Danes would ever fully accept him, but Uhtred was determined. He would reclaim Bebbanburg, no matter the cost. And if that meant fighting both the Danes and the Saxons to carve out his own destiny, then so be it. The chill of autumn swept across the land as Uhtred rode through the countryside of Wessex. The victory at Sinwit had not brought the peace he had hoped for. Instead, it left him feeling more conflicted than ever. The blood of Danes still stained his sword, and though he fought for Wessex, the bond he had forged with the Danes during his upbringing lingered, pulling at his conscience like a weight he could not shake. As he traveled toward the Saxon fortress, Uhtred couldn't help but feel the unease that gnawed at him. The whispers of Saxons questioning his loyalty had grown louder. Men who had fought beside him now looked at him with suspicion, their eyes reflecting a fear they dared not voice aloud. Uhtred had killed many Danes in battle, yet he fought with a ferocity that reminded them of their enemies, but there was something deeper at play, something Uhtred had tried to ignore for too long. He was a man born of two worlds, and each side demanded his loyalty. He was Uhtred of Bebbanburg, a Saxon noble by birth, but he was also Uhtred Ragnarsson, raised by Danes, a warrior forged in their fire. The conflict between these identities was reaching a breaking point. As night fell, Uhtred set up camp near a quiet village, Breda at his side. They had fought together for years, bound not only by their shared history but also by their love of the life they had known among the Danes. Breda sensed the storm within him, and as they sat by the fire, she finally broke the silence. "You're restless," she said, her voice low and steady. "What's bothering you, Uhtred?" He stared into the flames, watching as they danced and flickered, casting shadows that seemed to mirror the chaos in his mind. "I don't belong here," he admitted. "The Saxons don't trust me, and Alfred, he'll never see me as anything more than a tool to use against the Danes." Breda nodded, her gaze sharp. "You don't belong with the Saxons because you're not one of them. You never will be. You're a Dane at heart, Uhtred. You know that." Her words stung, but Uhtred couldn't deny the truth in them. He had lived among the Danes for so long that their ways had become his own. The Saxon life, with its strict piety and rigid structure, felt suffocating. Alfred's constant prayers, his obsession with the Christian God, grated on Uhtred's nerves, but it wasn't just Alfred's religion that bothered him. It was the way the king expected absolute loyalty, unquestioning faith in his vision of a united England. Uhtred respected Alfred's ambition, but he could never share his blind devotion. There was something in Alfred's piety that Uhtred could not trust, something cold and calculating beneath the surface. "I've spilled Saxon blood for the Danes," Uhtred said quietly, his thoughts heavy. "And I've spilled Danish blood for the Saxons. I don't know what I am anymore." Breda's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "You're a warrior. That's all that matters. The Saxons and the Danes, they'll keep fighting. but you can forge your own path. You don't owe either side anything. The following day, as Uhtred and Breda traveled through a forested valley, they encountered a group of Danes, old comrades from the days of Ragnar's leadership. They were led by Rollo, a warrior Uhtred had once considered a brother. The sight of him stirred old memories of battles fought side by side, of laughter and drink shared around the fires of Danish camps. Rollo's eyes lit up when he saw Uhtred. "Uhtred Ragnarsson," he called, his voice booming with warmth. "You're still alive. I had heard you were fighting for the Saxons now." Uhtred dismounted and clasped arms with Rollo, feeling a surge of old camaraderie. "For now," he said with a half-smile, though the weight of his choices hung heavy between them. The Danes around them greeted Uhtred like a long-lost brother, their hands clapping his back, their faces full of welcome. For a moment, Uhtred felt a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in Wessex. These were his people, the men he had grown up with, the warriors who had taught him to fight, to survive. They were Danes, and so was he, but that feeling of belonging was fleeting. As Rollo spoke of plans to raid Saxon lands, to strike fear into the hearts of Alfred's people, Uhtred felt a deep unease. He had fought beside these men once, but now their cause felt foreign to him. They were no longer just raiders, they were enemies of the land he had sworn to protect. Rollo studied Uhtred, sensing the hesitation. "You've changed," he said, his voice low. "You're not the same man who fought with us, Uhtred. What has Alfred done to you?" Uhtred bristled at the accusation. "Alfred hasn't done anything to me," he said, his tone defensive. "I fight for my birthright, for Bebbanburg." Rollo laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the trees. "Bebbanburg? You think the Saxons will give you that? You're a fool if you believe Alfred will ever let you have what's rightfully yours. He'll use you, Uhtred. And when he's done, he'll cast you aside." Uhtred clenched his fists, the conflict within him bubbling to the surface. Rollo's words hit too close to the truth. He knew that Alfred saw him as a tool, a weapon to be wielded against the Danes. But what choice did he have? The Saxons were his people by birth, and Bebbanburg was his destiny. Breda, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "He's right, Uhtred. The Danes are your family. We always have been. Forget Alfred and his pious vision. Come back to us." For a moment, Uhtred was tempted. He could see himself joining Rollo's band of warriors, living the life of a free man, unburdened by the politics of kings and the weight of Saxon expectations. He could return to the life he had known, the life that had once brought him purpose and joy, but then he remembered Ragnar's death, the betrayal that had taken everything from him. He remembered the Saxon blood that flowed through his veins, the birthright that had been stolen from him. And he knew that he couldn't turn his back on Wessex. "Not yet, I can't," Uhtred said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "Not while Bebbanburg remains in the hands of my enemies." Rollo's face darkened, and the warmth of their reunion faded. "Then you've made your choice," he said coldly. "But remember this, Uhtred, no matter how hard you try, the Saxons will never accept you as one of their own. And when that day comes, you'll have no one left. As Uhtred and Breda parted ways with Rollo and the Danes, the weight of their words lingered in the air. Uhtred's heart was heavy with doubt. He had chosen the Saxons for now, but the pull of his Danish family was strong. The more he fought for Alfred, the more he felt the bonds of loyalty to the Danes tugging at him, and then there was Alfred himself. The king's piety grated on Uhtred more with each passing day. Alfred's constant prayers, his obsession with the Christian God, it felt like chains around Uhtred's neck, binding him to a life he could never fully embrace. As they neared the Saxon stronghold, Uhtred spoke to Breda in a low voice. "I don't know how much longer I can serve Alfred." Breda nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then don't. Forge your own path, Uhtred. You don't owe him anything." Uhtred was silent, his mind torn between two worlds, two identities. He was Saxon by blood, but Danish by heart. And as the shadows of war closed in around him, he knew that the time would come when he would have to choose, once and for all, where his true loyalty lay. The skies above Wessex darkened as word spread of a new Danish invasion. This time, it wasn't just a raid. It was an organized assault, a full-scale invasion that threatened to crush Wessex, the last bastion of Saxon resistance. The Danes were coming, and with them came a familiar name, Ragnar the Younger, Uhtred's foster brother and once closest ally. The news hit Uhtred like a hammer blow. Ragnar had grown from the boy he once knew into a powerful warlord, now leading a force of Danes bent on conquering the Saxon lands. It was a cruel twist of fate. The brotherhood they once shared was now a source of pain, as Uhtred found himself staring down the possibility of fighting Ragnar, the man who had been his family when no one else was. Breda, standing by his side, read the conflict in his eyes. "Ragnar's coming," she said quietly, her voice edged with both excitement and sorrow. "This is what we've been waiting for." Uhtred's jaw clenched as he stared at the horizon, the weight of his choices bearing down on him. Wessex was under siege, but it wasn't just any army he would be fighting. This was Ragnar's army. His family. The news of Ragnar's arrival spread quickly through the court of King Alfred. The king's advisors were already discussing battle strategies when Uhtred entered the hall. The tension in the room was palpable, and all eyes turned toward him as soon as he stepped through the door. "Uhtred," Alfred greeted him, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "The Danes are coming. Ragnar the Younger leads them. I trust you know of him." Uhtred met Alfred's gaze, his expression unreadable. "Ragnar is my brother," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the significance of the words. "We were raised together." Alfred's eyes flickered with something unreadable, curiosity, perhaps, or maybe concern. "And now, he stands against Wessex. I need to know, Uhtred, where do your loyalties lie?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above Uhtred's head. His loyalty had always been questioned by the Saxons, and now, with Ragnar leading the charge, the doubts were louder than ever. Uhtred could feel the weight of the entire room bearing down on him, waiting for his answer. "I am loyal to Bebbanburg," Uhtred replied, his voice cold and clear. "But for now, I serve Wessex." Alfred studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Wessex needs you, Uhtred. We are the last kingdom standing against the Danes. If we fall, so does all of England." Uhtred said nothing, his thoughts racing. It was not loyalty to Alfred or Wessex that drove him, it was survival. If Wessex fell, the Danes would sweep across the land, and Uhtred's chance to reclaim Bebbanburg would be lost. He had no choice but to defend Wessex, for now that Uhtred and Breda prepared for the coming battle, their thoughts were clouded by the storm of emotions stirred by Ragnar's arrival. It had been years since they had last seen him, and the thought of facing him in battle filled Uhtred with a deep, conflicting sense of dread and longing, but there was no time to dwell on these feelings. The Danes were on the march, and Wessex needed every able warrior to stand against them. The Saxon lords gathered their forces, and Uhtred was placed in command of a small but fierce band of warriors, tasked with holding the western flank. His orders were clear: defend the stronghold at all costs. The tension between Uhtred and the Saxons had not disappeared. Many still distrusted him, whispering about his Danish upbringing and questioning whether he would truly stand against Ragnar. Uhtred could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their suspicion heavy on his shoulders. But he had no choice. He would fight, for Bebbanburg, if not for Wessex. As the sun set on the eve of battle, Uhtred and Breda received word from a scout. Ragnar's army was camped just a few miles north, preparing for the assault. The time had come to face his past. "We should go to him," Breda urged, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Ragnar is our family, Uhtred. He'll listen to us. We can fight with him, as we did before." Uhtred hesitated, the familiar pull of loyalty to Ragnar tugging at his heart. Breda was right, Ragnar was his brother, and there was a part of him that longed to return to the Danish life he had once loved. But the other part of him, the Saxon-born noble, knew that his path lay elsewhere. Bebbanburg, his true birthright, was still out of reach, and he couldn't abandon his quest now. "What if Ragnar sees us as traitors?" Uhtred asked, his voice low. "He's a different man now, Breda. We can't know if he'll listen." Breda's expression hardened. "Then we make him listen. We are his family, Uhtred. That still means something." As night fell, Uhtred and Breda made their way to Ragnar's camp. The fires of the Danish army lit up the night sky, casting long shadows over the land. Uhtred's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the camp, memories of his time with Ragnar flooding his mind. When they reached the outskirts of the camp, they were quickly recognized by Danish sentries. It didn't take long for them to be led into the heart of the camp, where Ragnar stood, surrounded by his warriors. He was older now, but the fire in his eyes was the same as Uhtred remembered. "Uhtred." Ragnar's voice boomed as he strode toward them, his face breaking into a grin. "Brother, it's been too long." For a moment, all of Uhtred's doubts and fears melted away. He embraced Ragnar, feeling the warmth of their brotherhood once again. It was as if no time had passed, and for a brief moment, Uhtred felt like he had come home, but the moment didn't last. Ragnar's expression darkened as he stepped back, his eyes searching Uhtred's face. "You're with the Saxons now, aren't you?" Uhtred nodded slowly. "For now, yes. But only because I have no other choice." Alfred holds Wessex, and without Wessex, I cannot reclaim Bebbanburg. Ragnar frowned, his gaze shifting to Breda. And you, Breda? Are you still loyal to the Danes? Breda met his gaze, her voice steady. I am loyal to you, Ragnar. But Uhtred's right. The Saxons may be our enemies, but they hold the key to Bebbanburg. We must play the long game. Ragnar's expression softened, but the tension between them remained. I understand your reasons, Uhtred. But you must understand mine. Wessex stands in the way of our people. I lead this army to claim what is rightfully ours. We are not here to negotiate. Uhtred's heart sank. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Ragnar would see reason, that they could avoid a battle between brothers. But it was clear now that Ragnar was committed to the Danish cause, and nothing Uhtred said would change that. I won't fight you, Uhtred said quietly. But I can't join you either. Ragnar's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the warmth of brotherhood was replaced by something colder. Then you'll stand in my way, he said, his voice hard. And when the time comes, Uhtred, you'll have to choose. As Uhtred and Breda left Ragnar's camp, the weight of their encounter pressed heavily on Uhtred's shoulders. The storm of war was brewing, and soon he would be forced to make a choice that could change everything. Would he stand with Wessex and defend the land of his birth, or would he join Ragnar and the Danes, his chosen family? The winds of war were rising, and Uhtred knew that no matter which path he chose, the consequences would be devastating. The dawn of the siege brought a heavy mist that clung to the earth like a shroud, muffling the sounds of battle and creating an eerie atmosphere around Wessex. The Danish forces had gathered in force, surrounding the kingdom with a grim determination that left no doubt about their intentions. Uhtred stood atop the stone wall of the fortress, his heart heavy as he surveyed the sea of armored warriors encamped beyond the gates. For days, the Danes had tested the walls of Wessex, probing for weaknesses and striking fear into the hearts of the Saxon defenders. Uhtred felt the weight of the impending storm. He was no longer just an observer, he was at the heart of the conflict, a man torn between two worlds. Uhtred. Breda called, breaking through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her eyes sharp with focus. We need to prepare for their next assault. They won't wait long. He nodded, but his mind raced. Each passing moment blurred the lines between loyalty and survival. The Saxons expected him to lead them, to fight as one of their own, but the memory of Ragnar's laughter and the bond they shared hung in the air like a ghost. Uhtred felt the cold grip of duty pulling him one way and the warmth of brotherhood pulling him the other. The first assault came with a roar, the Danes surging forward like a tidal wave, their battle cries echoing through the valley. Uhtred took his place among the defenders, sword in hand, adrenaline surging through his veins. The clang of steel and the cries of the wounded filled the air, a brutal symphony that drowned out any thoughts of hesitation. Hold the line. Uhtred shouted, rallying the Saxon warriors around him. His voice cut through the chaos, igniting a fierce determination among his men. They fought with the desperation of those who had everything to lose, their homes and families on the brink of destruction, but as he struck down a Dane, the familiar glint of a shield caught his eye. Ragnar, charging forward, leading his men with ferocity and courage. Uhtred's heart sank. This was no mere battle, it was a clash of brothers, and the stakes were higher than ever. They were not only fighting for their lands but for their identities, their legacies. The fighting intensified, and as the siege wore on, exhaustion seeped into the bones of every defender. The Saxons held their ground, but the Danes were relentless. Uhtred fought alongside his men, but with each fallen warrior, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. During a brief lull in the fighting, he found himself in a quiet corner of the fortress, catching his breath. Brida joined him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "You're losing yourself, Uhtred," she said, her voice laced with concern. "You fight like a Saxon, but your heart is still with the Danes." He met her gaze, the conflict within him raging like a wildfire. "I can't turn my back on Wessex. I've sworn to defend it. But at what cost?" Brida pressed, her eyes fierce. "If we win this battle, what will you have gained? Alfred's favor? You'll never belong here, Uhtred. You're torn between two worlds, and it's destroying you." Uhtred clenched his jaw, frustration boiling within him. He wanted to deny her words, to cling to the sense of purpose he had found among the Saxons. But deep down, he knew she was right. He was fighting for a kingdom that would never fully accept him, all while the Danes, his true family, prepared to lay waste to everything he held dear. As the siege dragged on, Uhtred faced moments of brutal clarity. In the heat of battle, he encountered a Danish warrior, one of Ragnar's closest friends, a man he had known and fought alongside years before. The two locked eyes, and for a heartbeat, the world fell away. "Uhtred," the man shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. "You fight for the Saxons now?" "Not by choice." Uhtred roared back, his sword raised. But in that fleeting moment, the line between friend and foe dissolved, and all he felt was a pang of loss for what they once shared. The clash that followed was savage. Uhtred fought fiercely, each swing of his sword filled with conflicting emotions. With every blow, he felt the weight of his choices, the loyalty to his Saxon comrades, the love for his Danish brothers. The blood of both spilled on the ground beneath him, and with it, his sense of identity. Days turned into a grueling week of siege, and as Uhtred stood upon the battlements once more, he watched as the Danish forces prepared for another assault. He knew that this time would be different. Ragnar would not hold back. The air was thick with tension, and Uhtred felt the storm brewing, both outside the fortress and within himself. Brida stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "What will you do if Ragnar comes for you?" she asked, her voice soft yet unwavering. Uhtred swallowed hard, his heart heavy with the weight of the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I will not fight him as an enemy. I cannot." "Then what will you do?" she pressed. "I'll stand between him and Wessex," Uhtred declared, determination hardening his resolve. "But I won't strike the first blow. If it comes to it, I'll remind him of our bond." Brida nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. She understood the complexity of his loyalty, the impossible choices he faced. But as the drums of war echoed from the Danish camp, Uhtred knew that time was running out. As the siege intensified, the walls of Wessex trembled under the weight of the assault. The next battle would not only decide the fate of the kingdom but would also force Uhtred to confront the truth of who he was, Saxon, Dane, or something else entirely. The storm was on the horizon, and Uhtred stood at the eye of it, torn between worlds, fighting for survival on both sides. As the siege of Wessex dragged on, the weight of despair hung heavily over the castle. The Saxon defenders were weary, and with each passing day, hope dwindled like the dwindling supplies within the walls. King Alfred, however, was not one to succumb easily to despair. In the dim light of the great hall, he convened his council, determination etched on his face. "We cannot continue to fight this battle in the traditional manner," Alfred declared, his voice steady but urgent. "The Danes are relentless, and their numbers only grow. We need to outthink them, not just outfight them." Uhtred stood at the edge of the council, listening intently. He had seen Alfred's strategic mind at work, and while he respected the king's intellect, the risks of his plans often left him uneasy. "What do you propose?" he asked, stepping forward. Alfred turned to Uhtred, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We will draw them out. A feigned retreat to lure Ragnar's forces into an ambush." The room fell silent as the council members exchanged uneasy glances. "A dangerous game, my lord," one advisor cautioned. "If they see through the ruse, they will not," Alfred interjected firmly. "Uhtred knows the Danes as well as I do. He can help ensure our deception is convincing." Uhtred felt a rush of pride mixed with trepidation. "I will do what I can, but the risk is immense. If it fails, Wessex will fall." Alfred nodded, his expression grave. "It is a gamble we must take. If we succeed, we can break their siege and reclaim our lands." The plan took shape over the next few days, the tension palpable as Uhtred trained the Saxon warriors in the art of retreat. He had to convince them that retreating was not a sign of cowardice but a necessary tactic. With every practiced maneuver, he felt the weight of expectation, his heritage, his loyalty to Alfred, and the specter of Ragnar looming over him. The night before the ambush, Uhtred found himself in a quiet corner of the castle, reflecting on the path that had led him here. The flickering shadows danced against the stone walls, a haunting reminder of his fractured loyalties. Brida joined him, sensing his turmoil. "You look troubled," she said, her voice low. "I am," he admitted. "Alfred trusts me, but I cannot shake the feeling that he sees me as a tool, something to be used against Ragnar. And yet, my ties to the Danes make this more complex." Brida stepped closer, her expression fierce. "You are not a tool, Uhtred. You are a warrior, torn between two worlds. But tomorrow, you fight for Wessex. Do not forget that." He nodded, though her words only half reassured him. As he drifted into a restless sleep, the sound of distant thunder rumbled in the night, a foreboding reminder of the storm that awaited them. The dawn of the ambush dawned gray and cold, a fitting backdrop for the treacherous plan they were about to execute. Uhtred stood at the forefront of the Saxon lines, his heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. The sound of the Danish war drums echoed in the distance, a thunderous reminder of the imminent clash. As they began their feigned retreat, Uhtred could feel the eyes of his Saxon comrades upon him. They trusted him, and the pressure to lead them to victory weighed heavily. The plan hinged on his ability to convince both sides, his Saxon brothers and the approaching Danes, that this retreat was genuine. Hold fast. Uhtred shouted as they began to fall back, the Danish forces responding as expected. Ragnar's men surged forward, emboldened by the apparent weakness of the Saxons. Uhtred's heart raced, every instinct screamed at him to fight, to rally his men, but he pushed those urges aside. The Danes followed, their battle cries ringing out, filling the air with a sense of impending triumph. Uhtred could see Ragnar among them, his armor gleaming in the muted light. The sight of his brother, charging forward, sent a wave of conflicting emotions crashing over him: loyalty, love, and a fierce desire to protect his newfound home. As the trap was set, Uhtred signaled to the Saxons to turn and regroup. The warriors spun back around, ready to meet their foes. The ambush erupted like a storm, the Saxons rallying with newfound ferocity as they faced the oncoming tide of Danes. Now, Uhtred roared, launching himself into the fray. The sound of clashing swords and the cries of men filled the air, a cacophony of violence that drowned out his thoughts. Uhtred fought with a fierce intensity, his sword carving a path through the chaos, each strike a reminder of the stakes at hand. But as the battle raged on, he caught sight of Ragnar again, locked in combat with one of the Saxon lords. Uhtred's heart raced as he charged forward, his mind racing with the implications of what he was about to do. If he intervened, it would be seen as betrayal by both sides, yet if he did not, he might lose his brother forever. Ragnar! Uhtred shouted, trying to cut through the din of battle. Ragnar turned, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, a flicker of recognition, a bond unbroken by the violence surrounding them. Uhtred. Ragnar replied, surprise evident on his face. You fight for them. I fight for us. Uhtred countered, desperation seeping into his voice. We can end this without more bloodshed. But Ragnar was already too far gone, and the fight continued, his attention diverted back to the Saxon lord. Uhtred's heart sank, feeling the chasm between them widen, the reality of their choices crashing down upon him. The battle continued, and as the tide began to turn in favor of the Saxons, Uhtred felt a swell of triumph. They had done it, they had caught the Danes off guard. But the victory felt hollow as he fought on, knowing that Ragnar was still out there, battling against the very family he once fought alongside. With the last of the Danish forces retreating, Uhtred found himself standing in the aftermath of the battlefield, breathing heavily and surveying the chaos. The victory was theirs, yet the cost weighed heavily upon him. The price of blood spilled was steep, and in that moment, the realization hit him like a blade: he had fought against his own blood. Alfred approached him, his expression a mix of triumph and concern. You did well, Uhtred. The Danes are broken. But Uhtred could only nod, his thoughts consumed by the knowledge of what he had lost. At what cost, Alfred? Ragnar will not forget this. Ragnar's loyalty lies with the Danes, not with you, Alfred replied sharply. You did what you had to do. Uhtred's heart pounded, anger bubbling beneath the surface. And yet, here I stand, a man without a home in either world. Alfred's eyes narrowed, the mutual distrust between them reaching a boiling point. You must choose, Uhtred. You can't play both sides forever. As Uhtred stared at the king, a sense of resolve settled in. "I will choose my own path," he declared, the weight of the decision pressing heavily upon him. "But it will not be dictated by you." With that, he turned away, feeling the fractures in his identity deepen. The battle may have been won, but the war within him was just beginning. The victory over the Danes had brought a temporary reprieve to Wessex, but peace felt precarious, like a fragile vase balanced on the edge of a table. Uhtred couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut, a feeling that something sinister lurked just beneath the surface. The days following the ambush were filled with celebration, but Uhtred felt disconnected from the revelry. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, he found himself wandering the castle's shadowy corridors, lost in thought. The weight of his choices hung heavily upon him: Saxon or Dane, loyalty or love, brother or king. It was in this haze of uncertainty that he overheard hushed voices coming from a nearby chamber. "Alfred is too weak," one voice hissed. "His piety blinds him to the true threat. We must act before he leads us to ruin." Uhtred pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear more. The second voice, smooth and cunning, replied, "There are those who would support us. If we can undermine his authority, we can install a leader who will not hesitate to take decisive action against the Danes." His heart raced as he realized he was eavesdropping on a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of Wessex. Uhtred stepped back, his mind racing. Who were these traitors? And what did they plan to do? He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The following days were filled with tension as Uhtred sought to uncover the identity of the conspirators. He discreetly gathered information from trusted allies, piecing together fragments of conversations and suspicious behavior. It soon became clear that discontent was brewing among certain factions within the court, disillusioned by Alfred's methods and his refusal to take more aggressive action against the Danes. In the shadows of the castle, Uhtred learned that a prominent nobleman, Lord Cedric, had been rallying support among the discontented. Uhtred's heart sank. Cedric had always been a snake in the grass, his ambitions hidden behind a mask of loyalty. Determined to confront the traitor, Uhtred arranged to meet with Alfred that evening. The king, busy poring over maps and reports of Danish movements, looked up as Uhtred entered. "Uhtred," Alfred said, weariness lining his features. "What brings you here at such an hour?" "There's a conspiracy, my lord," Uhtred began, his voice urgent. "Lord Cedric is rallying support to undermine your rule. He seeks to install a leader more aligned with his ambitions." Alfred's brow furrowed, skepticism flashing in his eyes. "Cedric? Are you certain of this?" "I have my sources," Uhtred replied, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "He believes that your cautious approach will lead to Wessex's downfall. He will strike soon, while you are preoccupied with the remnants of the Danes." Alfred sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is troubling news, Uhtred. But I cannot act without evidence. Such accusations could destabilize my rule further." "Do not let pride blind you," Uhtred pressed. "You must take action before it's too late. The longer you wait, the stronger Cedric's faction will become." Alfred regarded him for a moment, uncertainty etched across his face. "You want me to act against a nobleman without proof?" If I fail to expose him, it will turn the court against me. And if you do nothing, you risk losing everything, Uhtred replied, determination hardening his voice. Trust in me, Alfred. I know how these men think. Give me a chance to uncover their plans. Alfred finally nodded, though unease lingered in his eyes. Very well, Uhtred. I will give you this opportunity, but tread carefully. Betrayal is a dangerous game. Uhtred plunged into the heart of Wessex's intrigue, employing the skills he had honed as a warrior to navigate the treacherous waters of politics. He infiltrated gatherings, engaged in whispered conversations, and laid traps to draw out Cedric's supporters. Days turned into weeks, and just as Uhtred began to feel the weight of doubt creeping in, he uncovered the full extent of Cedric's plot. The nobleman had been orchestrating a rebellion, intending to stage an attack during a gathering of the king's council, using the chaos to seize power. Realizing the urgency of the situation, Uhtred rushed to inform Alfred, his heart pounding as he prepared to deliver the news. He burst into the great hall where the council was convening, breathless and urgent. Alfred, he called, the eyes of the assembled nobles turning toward him in surprise. We must act now. Cedric plans to betray you during tonight's council. A murmur rippled through the room as Alfred rose, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. What proof do you have? Uhtred took a deep breath, revealing the details he had uncovered. I overheard their plans, my lord. They intend to strike while you are vulnerable. If we don't confront them now, you will lose your reign, and Wessex will be plunged into chaos. Alfred's gaze hardened as he considered the implications. If this is true, we must expose Cedric before he can act. That evening, the council gathered, the air thick with tension. Uhtred stood at Alfred's side, ready to act. The doors opened, and Cedric strode in, confidence radiating from him. Uhtred could see the flicker of disdain in Cedric's eyes as he assessed the assembled nobles. Lord Cedric, Alfred began, his voice steady but heavy with authority. You are accused of plotting against the crown. Cedric's expression shifted from surprise to indignation. What madness is this? I am loyal to Wessex and to you, Alfred. Uhtred stepped forward, his resolve unwavering. Loyalty does not hide behind the shadows, Cedric. I have evidence of your conspiracy to undermine the king. You cannot deny it any longer. The room erupted into chaos as Cedric's supporters bristled, their loyalty challenged. Cedric, cornered, tried to salvage his position. This is nothing but a ruse. Uhtred is using his past to manipulate you. But Alfred's voice cut through the noise. Enough. I will not tolerate treachery within my court. Uhtred, bring forth the witnesses. With a few carefully chosen allies supporting Uhtred's claims, the evidence against Cedric mounted. The nobleman's facade began to crumble, desperation etching itself into his features. Finally, with the council's consensus, Cedric was arrested, the rebellion quelled before it could truly begin. As the echoes of outrage faded, Uhtred felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. Later that night, Uhtred found himself alone on the battlements, the cool wind biting at his skin. Alfred joined him, his expression contemplative. You acted swiftly, Uhtred, the king said, a hint of gratitude in his tone. "But know this, the next time you uncover treachery, I will expect you to bring it directly to me. We cannot have you playing both sides." Uhtred turned to face Alfred, a simmering tension still present between them. "I am not your pawn, Alfred. I fight for Wessex, yes, but my ties to the Danes remain. I must navigate both worlds." "Then you must choose where your loyalty lies," Alfred replied, his voice firm. "For there may come a time when that choice will be tested." As Uhtred gazed out into the night, he realized the truth in Alfred's words. The lines between Saxon and Dane, loyalty and betrayal, were blurred, and the conflict within him was far from over. He had chosen to protect Wessex, but at what cost to his own identity? As the moon cast its pale light over the battlements, Uhtred felt the weight of impending storms, knowing that the battle for his soul was far from finished. In the aftermath of the council's upheaval, Uhtred stood on the precipice of a new mission, one that would take him deep behind enemy lines. King Alfred had grown increasingly anxious about the Danes regrouping and planning another assault on Wessex. Uhtred knew the stakes: the longer they allowed the Danes to gather strength, the greater the threat to everything he had fought for. "Tomorrow, we strike," Alfred announced during a war council, his voice firm. "Uhtred, I want you to lead a raid into the heart of Danish territory. We need to disrupt their supply lines and show them that Wessex will not cower." Uhtred nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. The mission was perilous, but the chance to confront the Danes head-on called to him like a siren's song. As he gathered a band of trusted warriors, he felt the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders. He was not just fighting for Wessex, he was also fighting for his identity. The night before the raid, Uhtred gathered his men, their faces illuminated by flickering torches. "Listen well, brothers," he began, his voice low but steady. "We are not just raiding to destroy supplies, we are striking a blow against our enemies. We do this to protect our homes, our families. Remember, this is for Wessex, but also for ourselves." The men cheered, their spirits buoyed by Uhtred's words. Among them was Finan, a warrior who had fought alongside Uhtred through countless battles. "We'll follow you to the gates of hell, Uhtred," Finan said, clasping his shoulder. "Let's show the Danes what true warriors can do." As dawn broke, Uhtred and his men set out, their hearts steeled for the challenge ahead. The cold air bit at their skin, but the promise of battle warmed their spirits. They moved swiftly, relying on the cover of the trees to remain undetected as they approached the Danish encampment. The raid was executed with precision. Uhtred and his men struck like lightning, slashing through the surprised Danish sentries before chaos erupted in the camp. Uhtred fought with a fierce determination, every swing of his sword fueled by the memory of his fallen kin and the weight of his divided loyalties. "Take down their supply tents," Uhtred shouted, leading the charge into the heart of the encampment. The clash of steel rang out, mingling with the shouts of the Danes as they scrambled to respond to the sudden assault. The air was thick with smoke and blood, the scent of battle intoxicating. Uhtred fought with a clarity that surged through him, each blow a catharsis. Yet, amidst the chaos, he felt the familiar pull of conflicting emotions: his past life among the Danes, his loyalty to Wessex, and the brothers he had lost that as they wreaked havoc on the Danish supplies, Uhtred caught sight of Ragnar the Younger across the battlefield, his eyes filled with fury and disbelief. "Uhtred!" Ragnar shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "You fight for them now?" "Ragnar!" Uhtred shouted back, desperation lacing his words. "This isn't what it has to be. We can end this without more blood." But before he could take a step toward him, a Danish warrior lunged at Uhtred, and in the flurry of battle, their blades clashed. Uhtred fought with everything he had, but his heart was heavy with the weight of betrayal. He had been raised among the Danes, now, he found himself on the opposite side, a traitor in their eyes. The raid continued, but soon the tide began to turn. The Danes rallied, and the battle shifted as they regrouped. Uhtred felt the pressure mounting, the realization that they were vastly outnumbered weighing heavily on his shoulders. "Fall back," he shouted, recognizing the need to retreat before it was too late. But just as they began to regroup, a shadow fell over him. A spear flew through the air, piercing the chaos and finding its mark. Uhtred turned to see Finan, his loyal friend, crumpling to the ground, blood pooling around him. "No!" Uhtred screamed, rushing to Finan's side, the world around him blurring in an instant. "Stay with me, brother." Finan gasped, pain etched on his face. "Uhtred, you must go. Don't let it end like this." Uhtred felt the world shatter around him. "I can't leave you," he pleaded, desperation clawing at his throat. "Go. Fight for Wessex, for our people," Finan urged, his voice growing weaker. "Promise me, you'll win this." Tears stung Uhtred's eyes, but the roar of battle pulled him back to reality. He looked at Finan, the man who had fought by his side through thick and thin. "I promise," he said, his voice breaking. With one last look at his fallen friend, Uhtred rose, heart heavy with grief. The men were retreating, and the urgency of their escape drove him forward. He fought his way through the fray, each swing of his sword now a blend of vengeance and sorrow. As they finally broke free from the chaos of the camp and fled into the cover of the trees, Uhtred felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. They had successfully disrupted the Danish supply lines, but at a cost that left him hollow. Finan was gone, and with him, a piece of Uhtred's heart. The ride back to Wessex was grim, silence heavy among the remaining men. Uhtred rode at the front, his mind racing with memories of Finan, his laughter, and their shared dreams of victory. The stark reality of his divided loyalties crashed down upon him. He was neither fully Saxon nor Dane, forever caught in the crossfire of two worlds. Upon reaching the walls of Wessex, Uhtred felt a mixture of triumph and despair. They had accomplished their mission, but the loss of Finan weighed heavily on him, a reminder of the fragile line he walked between loyalty and betrayal. As he dismounted, Alfred approached him, concern etched across his face. "You did well, Uhtred. The Danes will think twice before they threaten us again." Uhtred's heart felt like stone. "We paid a heavy price, my lord. Finan, he's gone." The words hung in the air, an ache that could not be filled. Alfred's expression shifted, sympathy mingling with understanding. "War demands sacrifices, Uhtred. We must honor those we've lost by continuing the fight." "I know," Uhtred replied, the anger and sorrow swirling within him. But each loss brings me closer to losing myself. I cannot choose between my past and my present without tearing apart who I am. Alfred regarded him, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Then we must find a way to unite the worlds you straddle. You have a role to play in this new kingdom we build. Use your past as a strength, not a weakness. Uhtred nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. As he looked out over the horizon, he realized that the path ahead was fraught with challenges and sacrifices yet to come. He had to reconcile the blood on his hands with the loyalty in his heart, or risk losing everything he held dear. With Finan's memory burning brightly within him, Uhtred steeled himself for the battles ahead, both on the battlefield and within his soul. The haunting memories of Finan weighed heavily on Uhtred as he stared out over the rolling hills of Wessex. The victory from the raid behind enemy lines felt hollow without his friend at his side, but a new fire ignited within him, the relentless desire to reclaim Bebbanburg, his ancestral home. The ghosts of his past called to him, urging him to confront the usurper who now held his birthright. Gathering his thoughts, Uhtred sought an audience with King Alfred. As he entered the war room, he found the king poring over maps, surrounded by advisors. Alfred looked up, sensing Uhtred's urgency. "Uhtred, what troubles you?" he asked, setting aside a parchment. "It is time for me to confront the usurper of Bebbanburg," Uhtred declared, determination etched into his features. "I cannot stand idle while my home remains in the hands of a stranger. I will gather my men and take back what is rightfully mine." Alfred regarded him, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You know the risks. The current lord of Bebbanburg is well fortified and not easily bested. He has the loyalty of the local nobles and the support of the Danes. I have fought against impossible odds before," Uhtred replied, his voice steady. "I am not asking for your army, but I need your blessing and whatever resources you can spare. This is a personal battle, one that I must undertake for myself and for my family." After a moment of contemplation, Alfred nodded, recognizing the fire in Uhtred's heart. "Very well. You have my support. Take what you need, and may the gods be with you." In the days that followed, Uhtred prepared for the journey to Bebbanburg. He gathered a small but loyal band of warriors, those who had fought alongside him in the past and shared his desire to reclaim his birthright. Finan's absence left a void, but his spirit inspired Uhtred to lead with the same courage and conviction. As they traveled north, Uhtred felt a mix of anticipation and dread. The landscapes of his childhood unfolded before him, yet the memories were bittersweet, haunted by the past. Bebbanburg rose on the horizon, a formidable fortress that had once been his home, its stone walls dark against the sky. Upon reaching the outskirts of the castle, Uhtred and his men dismounted and surveyed the surroundings. The fortress loomed ahead, heavily guarded and fortified. The usurper, a man named Haldan, had entrenched himself there, ruling with an iron fist and exploiting the land's resources. Uhtred, one of his men, Uhtred, whispered, "How do you plan to get past those walls? We'll be outnumbered." Uhtred's mind raced with strategies. "We'll approach under the cover of darkness. I'll create a diversion at the eastern wall while the rest of you scale the western side. The guards will be focused on the noise, and we'll take them by surprise. His men nodded, steeling themselves for the challenge ahead. They waited until nightfall, the shadows cloaking their movements as they crept toward the fortress. The air was thick with tension as Uhtred led them to their positions. The diversion began with a loud crash, echoing through the night as Uhtred hurled stones against the eastern wall. Shouts erupted from the guards, confusion rippling through the ranks. Uhtred's heart raced as he signaled his men to advance toward the western side. Scaling the walls was a grueling task, but Uhtred's determination fueled them forward. They reached the battlements, and Uhtred found himself face to face with the guards stationed there. A fierce battle erupted, swords clashing and cries of alarm echoing across the courtyard. Uhtred fought with the ferocity of a lion, the adrenaline coursing through him. Each strike was fueled by the memories of his family, his birthright, and the pain of loss. His men followed his lead, and together they fought their way through the chaos. As they pushed deeper into the fortress, Uhtred felt the presence of Haldan looming ahead. The usurper would be waiting, fortified by his men and the fear of losing his claim to Bebbanburg. The final confrontation came in the great hall, where the flickering torches cast shadows that danced ominously on the walls. Haldan stood at the far end, flanked by his loyal guards, a smug smile etched across his face. Uhtred, Haldan sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You return to claim what is not yours. You were a boy when you were taken. You have no right here. I have every right, Uhtred replied, stepping forward, his sword raised. This land is mine by blood, and I will not let you continue to defile it. The hall erupted into violence, swords clashing and men shouting as the two sides collided. Uhtred charged at Haldan, their swords meeting with a metallic clang. The usurper was strong, but Uhtred fought with the weight of his lineage behind him, every blow resonating with purpose. As the battle raged on, Uhtred felt the tide shifting in his favor. He could hear the cries of his men rallying, the determination echoing in their voices. Each victory against Haldan's guards fueled Uhtred's resolve, the memories of his childhood and his family driving him forward. In a climactic moment, Uhtred disarmed Haldan, sending the usurper's sword clattering to the floor. Haldan fell to his knees, fear flashing across his face. Please, Uhtred. Spare my life. You can take back the lands without killing me. Uhtred hesitated, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. He thought of the injustices that had been done, the family he had lost, and the years spent fighting for his place in this world. No, Uhtred said, his voice steady and resolute. You have taken everything from me. This is not just about land, it is about honor. With that, he delivered the final blow, ending Haldan's claim to Bebbanburg. As the usurper fell, silence swept over the hall. Uhtred stood amidst the chaos, breathless and victorious. The fight had cost him dearly, but as his men cheered and rallied around him, Uhtred felt a surge of pride. Bebbanburg was his once more, the weight of his heritage lifting from his shoulders. Yet, as he looked around the hall, he knew that the journey to reclaiming his identity was far from over. With the dawn breaking over the horizon, casting a golden light over the fortress, Uhtred turned to his men. We have taken back what is ours, but we must not forget the battles that lie ahead. This is just the beginning. As they began to rebuild, Uhtred realized that Bebbanburg would not just be a place to reclaim, it would be the heart of his new beginning. He had forged a path through blood and sacrifice, and now, with his ancestral home reclaimed, he would strive to create a legacy worthy of his family's name. In the depths of his heart, Uhtred understood that the fight for his identity would continue, but he was ready to face whatever challenges awaited him, Saxon or Dane. He would forge his own destiny. With Bebbanburg reclaimed, Uhtred rode south with purpose, the weight of his ancestral home heavy on his shoulders. The journey back to Wessex was both triumphant and somber. Victory had tasted sweet, but the blood spilled in battle lingered bitterly in his mind. As he crossed the threshold into Wessex, he felt the pulse of the land, the tension in the air, the whispers of impending conflict. Upon entering the fortified walls of Winchester, Uhtred was met with a rousing welcome. The news of his victory had spread, igniting a flicker of hope among the Saxons. Yet, beneath the surface, Uhtred sensed an undercurrent of fear. Wessex stood as the last bastion against the relentless tide of Danish invaders, and the weight of that responsibility now rested squarely on his shoulders. King Alfred met him in the great hall, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows as they embraced. "You have done what many thought impossible," Alfred said, a glimmer of pride shining in his eyes. "Bebbanburg is yours once more." "Not just mine, my lord," Uhtred replied, his voice steady. "It belongs to my family, to the legacy of my ancestors. But our fight is far from over. The Danes will not rest until they claim Wessex entirely." Alfred nodded, his expression grave. "We must prepare." They gather strength, emboldened by their victories. You, Uhtred, are key to our survival. Your unique position, torn between both worlds, gives you insights we desperately need. Uhtred felt the weight of those words. His dual heritage, once a source of turmoil, had now become an asset. He was neither fully Saxon nor Danish, but a bridge between two cultures, an unexpected ally in a battle that would determine the fate of Wessex. The following days were filled with strategy and preparation. Uhtred worked closely with Alfred and his advisors, offering insights on Danish tactics and culture, drawing upon his experiences from both sides. Yet, amidst the camaraderie, Uhtred felt the shadows of doubt creeping in. His past weighed heavily on him, the bloodshed and the choices he had made echoing in his mind. In a private moment, he confided in Alfred. "I fear that in embracing my role as a leader, I have forsaken the very things that make me who I am. Am I a Saxon fighting for Wessex, or a Dane fighting against my blood?" Alfred studied him thoughtfully. "You are Uhtred of Bebbanburg, a warrior forged by the fires of both cultures. Do not see your past as a burden, but as a strength. Your understanding of both sides is crucial to our survival." Uhtred nodded, though uncertainty lingered. The legacy of his choices weighed heavily. He had taken lives, betrayed old comrades, and now found himself a critical player in the survival of Wessex. How could he reconcile the two sides of himself in a world that demanded clarity? As the weeks passed, the storm clouds gathered over Wessex. Reports of a new Danish invasion reached them, led by a fierce warlord named Sweyn. The whispers of war grew louder, filling the halls of Winchester with a sense of urgency. Uhtred and Alfred knew that time was running out. In the great hall, Uhtred stood before a gathering of warriors, his heart pounding with purpose. "The Danes will soon come for us. We are not just defending a kingdom, we are fighting for our very way of life. They will seek to destroy our homes and our families. We must stand united, Saxon and Dane alike, to protect what is ours." The men nodded, their resolve hardening. Uhtred's words echoed with the weight of his experiences, resonating with those who understood the price of war. He had fought for both sides. Now, he would lead the Saxons into battle against their common enemy. The day of battle arrived, the air thick with tension. Uhtred stood alongside Alfred, surveying the battlefield as the sun rose, casting a golden light over the gathering forces. The Danish army loomed in the distance, a dark tide ready to swallow them whole. "Stay close, Uhtred," Alfred said, his voice steady. "Your knowledge of their tactics will guide us." As the armies clashed, chaos erupted around them. Uhtred fought with a fierce intensity, the lessons learned from both Saxon and Danish warriors flooding his mind. Each swing of his sword was a testament to his duality, and he felt the weight of his heritage surge through him. Yet, as the battle raged, the brutality of war bore down on him. He witnessed the slaughter of both sides, the cries of men echoing in his ears. With every fallen warrior, Uhtred felt the strain of his choices. What did it mean to fight for Wessex while still holding a place in his heart for the Danes he had called brothers? Amidst the chaos, Uhtred faced Sweyn in a brutal clash of wills. The warlord was a fierce opponent, his rage palpable as they battled. "You fight for the Saxons now, Uhtred, but you will always be a Dane at heart," Sweyn spat, each word laced with venom. "I fight for my home." Uhtred shouted back, fury igniting his strikes. "And I will not let you take it from me." With a final, decisive blow, Uhtred felled Sweyn, the warlord collapsing to the ground. The victory was bittersweet. He felt the echoes of his choices reverberating within him. He had won the battle, but at what cost? As the dust settled, Uhtred looked over the battlefield, the devastation laid bare before him. The cries of the wounded filled the air, and he realized that the fight for Wessex was also a fight for himself, a fight to reconcile the two halves of his identity. Returning to the great hall, Uhtred was met with cheers and accolades, but the weight of his actions pressed heavily upon him. He had secured Wessex's survival, but the echoes of battle reminded him of the lives lost and the bonds severed. Alfred approached him, a proud smile on his face, but Uhtred saw the concern behind the king's eyes. "You have done what many thought impossible, Uhtred. Wessex stands strong because of your bravery." Uhtred took a deep breath, his heart heavy. "But at what price, my lord? The blood we shed today will haunt us for generations." Alfred nodded, understanding the depth of Uhtred's struggle. "That burden is not yours alone to carry. We all bear the scars of war. But know this, you are the embodiment of the future we seek, a united England, born from the ashes of conflict." Uhtred met Alfred's gaze, a flicker of resolve igniting within him. "Then I will strive to honor both my Saxon and Danish blood. I will fight to forge a new legacy, one that honors all sides." In that moment, Uhtred understood the path before him. He was not merely a warrior, he was a leader capable of bridging the divide between two worlds. The last kingdom stood strong, and together, they would face whatever came next, Saxon and Dane united in a new vision for England. As he looked out over the gathered warriors, Uhtred felt a surge of hope. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was ready to embrace his destiny, whatever it may hold. The aftermath of the battle against Sweyn left Wessex reeling but resolute. Uhtred stood on the ramparts of Winchester, overlooking the fields where so much had been lost and won. Each breath he took felt heavy with the weight of choices past and present. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, he felt the ghosts of his history drawing closer. The Danish forces had not been completely vanquished. Whispers of another invasion reached him through the night. A new leader, one more cunning and ruthless than Sweyn, sought to reclaim the glory of their forebears and the lands they had once occupied. Uhtred could sense it. The final confrontation loomed, and it would demand a reckoning with his past. A summons from King Alfred brought Uhtred to the war room, where the mood was somber yet determined. Alfred paced before a map, his brow furrowed with worry. Uhtred, the Danes gather again, led by a warlord named Hakon. He is relentless and seeks to unify the fractured Danish forces. We must prepare for the worst. Uhtred's heart quickened. Hakon was a name he had heard in whispers, one of the fiercest warriors of the north, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. What do you propose? Uhtred asked, his voice steady despite the tempest brewing within him. We will draw them into a trap, lure them away from their strengths, Alfred replied. But I need your insight. You know their tactics and their mindset better than any of my advisors. Then we will fight with strategy, not just brute force, Uhtred declared. Yet, as he spoke, the specter of his past loomed large, reminding him of the ties he had forged with those who would soon be his enemies. Days turned into nights as Uhtred pored over plans, the weight of leadership resting heavily on him. He found himself haunted by memories of the Danes who had raised him, the brothers he had lost, and the blood he had shed on both sides. Each decision felt like a step deeper into a labyrinth of identity. Was he Saxon? Dane? Or something entirely new? The night before the battle, Uhtred sought solace in the quiet of the courtyard. The stars twinkled overhead, indifferent to the turmoil in his heart. It was then that he heard a familiar voice, a soft, haunting call from the shadows. Uhtred. He turned to see Brida, her expression a mixture of concern and strength. You are troubled, she said, stepping closer. I can see it in your eyes. I fear what tomorrow will bring, Uhtred admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Hakon is not just a warlord, he is a force of nature. I feel the pull of my past, the connections that bind me to the very people I must fight. Brida reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. You cannot change who you are, Uhtred. You are both Saxon and Dane, and that is your strength. Embrace it. Let us with the fire that resides within you. Her words ignited a flicker of resolve in him, but the conflict within remained. As he looked into her eyes, he saw the reflections of all he had fought for and all he stood to lose. The day of the battle arrived, the air thick with tension and anticipation. As Uhtred rode alongside Alfred's forces, he felt the weight of every decision he had made. Each warrior beside him was a testament to the lives intertwined in this struggle for a new England, a country that could be born from the ashes of conflict. As the two armies clashed on the battlefield, Uhtred's heart raced. The chaos of war surged around him, the cries of men echoing in his ears as he fought with a ferocity born from the depths of his soul. With each strike, he grappled not only with his enemies but with his own identity. Then, through the tumult, Uhtred saw Hakon, a figure clad in dark armor, commanding his men with a fierce intensity. The sight of him ignited something primal within Uhtred. He fought his way through the chaos, determined to confront this embodiment of his past. When they finally met, it was like a storm had gathered. Hakon's eyes gleamed with recognition, a smirk creeping across his lips. "Uhtred, the Saxon-born Dane. I have heard tales of your exploits. Why do you fight against your blood?" "I fight for a future, Hakon," Uhtred replied, his voice firm. "One that does not dwell in the past but builds upon it. I will not allow you to take this land, nor will I let you define who I am." With that, they clashed, swords meeting with a violent clang that resonated across the battlefield. Uhtred fought with every ounce of strength and conviction he possessed, each swing fueled by the memories of his ancestors, the Saxons who had come before him, the Danes who had raised him. The battle was fierce, but Uhtred's resolve held steady. As they exchanged blows, he felt his past and present converge in a whirlwind of purpose. In that moment, he understood that he was not simply one or the other, he was both, and it was this unique perspective that gave him power. With a final, decisive strike, Uhtred disarmed Hakon, sending the warlord's sword spiraling to the ground. Hakon fell to his knees, panting, the defiance in his eyes replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "You are a true warrior, Uhtred. But you cannot escape your heritage." "I do not seek to escape it," Uhtred said, standing tall before his fallen adversary. "I embrace it. I am both Saxon and Dane, and I will fight for a new destiny, one that unites us rather than divides us." With a swift motion, Uhtred ended Hakon's claim to power, and the realization struck him with a bittersweet pang. The battle was won, but it came at a great personal cost, yet he understood now that his identity was not defined by blood but by choice. As the sun set on the battlefield, casting a golden hue over the remnants of war, Uhtred stood surrounded by the fallen and the victorious. He felt the ache of loss for those who had perished, but also a profound sense of hope. The birth of England was upon them, and he would play a pivotal role in shaping its future. Returning to Wessex, Uhtred faced his people, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. They had survived, and in that survival, he saw the promise of a united kingdom, a realm born from the sacrifices of many. In the quiet moments that followed, Uhtred felt the echoes of his past recede, replaced by a vision of what lay ahead. He was no longer torn between two worlds, he was a part of something greater, a legacy that would honor both his Saxon and Danish roots. Destiny was indeed all, and Uhtred knew that his path was just beginning. The days following Hakon's defeat were filled with a fragile peace, yet the shadow of impending conflict loomed over Wessex. Uhtred could feel it in the air, a palpable tension that signaled the final confrontation for the future of not just Wessex, but all of England. The Danes would not accept defeat so easily, they would rally again, and when they did, it would be with a vengeance. In the great hall of Winchester, Uhtred stood alongside King Alfred, their faces illuminated by flickering torches. The map before them was littered with markers representing the enemy forces, a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. "We must strike first," Alfred declared, determination etched across his features. "We cannot allow them to gather their strength." Uhtred nodded, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily on him. "We need to leverage our advantages. My knowledge of Danish tactics can help us outmaneuver them, but we must act swiftly." "Then we shall gather our forces," Alfred replied. "This time, we fight not just for Wessex, but for the future of England." As the sun rose on the day of the final battle, Uhtred stood with the Saxon warriors, their resolve unyielding. The echoes of camaraderie and shared purpose filled the air, a stark contrast to the loneliness that had accompanied him through much of his journey. He looked out across the assembled men, Saxons, Danes, and those caught in between, all united under a common cause. "Today, we fight for our homes, our families, and our future," Uhtred shouted, his voice resonating across the ranks. "We will forge a new nation from the blood we shed together. No more shall we be divided by heritage, we are one people, and together, we will prevail." The warriors raised their weapons in response, the clashing of metal ringing out like a war cry, echoing the resolve in their hearts. Uhtred felt a surge of energy within him, a connection to each man fighting by his side. They were not just allies, they were brothers in arms, ready to defend what was theirs. As they marched toward the battlefield, the sight of the Danish army gathered in the distance sent a chill through Uhtred's spine. He spotted familiar faces among the ranks, former comrades from his days with the Danes. The realization that he would soon face them filled him with conflicting emotions. They were warriors he had fought alongside, yet they were now on the opposite side of this momentous clash. When the two forces met, chaos erupted. Uhtred fought with ferocity, each strike a testament to the weight of his journey. He could hear the cries of men around him, the clash of swords, and the thundering of hooves as the battle waged on. He felt the heat of battle seep into his bones, igniting the fire within him, a fire that was fueled by his desire for a united England. In the midst of the tumult, Uhtred faced an old friend, Gunnar, a formidable warrior from his days among the Danes. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Uhtred, you fight for the Saxons now?" Gunnar shouted over the clamor. "I fight for a future that embraces both our worlds." Uhtred replied, raising his sword. "Join me, Gunnar. We can forge something new together." But Gunnar shook his head, a mixture of sorrow and determination on his face. "I cannot abandon my people, Uhtred. You chose your side." With that, they clashed, the past crashing into the present in a violent collision of loyalties. Uhtred fought hard, but he felt the weight of the choices he had made. Each strike against Gunnar resonated with the pain of what could have been. The battle raged on, blood spilling across the ground, mingling with the mud as the two armies clashed in a brutal display of survival. Uhtred fought with everything he had, but as the hours wore on, he began to see the toll it was taking. Friends fell, their lifeblood soaking the earth, and with each loss, Uhtred's heart felt heavier. Finally, in a moment that felt like an eternity, the tide began to shift. Uhtred led a charge against the Danish lines, his presence igniting a fierce spirit within his men. They pressed forward, determined to claim victory, but just as it seemed they would overwhelm the enemy, a piercing cry shattered the air. Breda, fighting valiantly by Uhtred's side, fell under the weight of an enemy's blow, collapsing to the ground. Uhtred's heart dropped as he witnessed her fall. "Breda!" he shouted, cutting through the throng of men toward her. As he reached her side, despair washed over him. Breda lay on the ground, her face pale, but her spirit remained defiant. "Uhtred," she gasped, blood staining her hands as she struggled to speak. "Finish this, for all of us." With tears blurring his vision, Uhtred nodded, the pain of her words piercing through him. He felt the fire of battle ignite again within him, fueled by loss and resolve. "I will not let your sacrifice be in vain," he vowed, rising to face the enemy once more. In the final surge, Uhtred pushed through the chaos, rallying the Saxons to drive back the Danish forces. The cries of his fallen friends echoed in his mind, spurring him forward. As the day waned, the ground was soaked with blood, both Saxon and Dane. Finally, the Danish forces began to falter, the tide of battle shifting irrevocably. Uhtred and his men pressed on, determination fueling their every move. It was then that he spotted Gunnar once more, cornered and outnumbered. The look in his eyes mirrored Uhtred's own, defiance mingled with desperation. "Gunnar!" Uhtred shouted, pushing through the fray. "We can still end this together." But before Gunnar could respond, a stray arrow flew through the air, striking him down before Uhtred's eyes. Time froze as Uhtred watched the light fade from his friend's eyes, his heart breaking under the weight of what had transpired. "No!" Uhtred cried, rage and sorrow merging into a single, powerful force. He charged forward, cutting down the enemies surrounding Gunnar's body, his heart pounding with grief. The battle was won, but the cost was staggering. As the dust settled and the cries of battle faded into silence, Uhtred stood amidst the remnants of war, surrounded by the fallen. He felt the ache of loss, Breda, Gunnar, and countless others who had paid the ultimate price. They had fought for a dream, and now it was his duty to honor that sacrifice. With the last remnants of the Danish army fleeing, Uhtred turned back to his comrades. He raised his sword high, the bloodied blade catching the dying light of day. "We have forged a new nation today. One built on the sacrifices of many. Let us honor them by standing united as one people." The surviving warriors cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of triumph and mourning. They were not just Saxons or Danes anymore, they were the foundation of something greater, a new England, born from the ashes of conflict. As Uhtred looked out over the battlefield, he felt the weight of his identity shift once more. He was a warrior forged in blood, bound by duty to honor those who had fallen. Standing between two worlds, he understood that his fate was intertwined with England's future. With the sun setting behind him, Uhtred felt a sense of peace settling over his heart. Destiny was not a path set in stone, it was a choice, a commitment to the land and people he had come to love. He would fight for this new nation, honoring the legacy of both Saxon and Dane, ensuring that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. In that moment, he knew, he was not just Uhtred of Bebbanburg. He was Uhtred of England, and he would protect it with every ounce of his being.